Welcome back to SoCap Talks, helping innovators build tomorrow today. Now here's your hosts, Devin Kearns and Eric Sutphin.
All right, well, we are back at SoCap Talks, and today we have the distinct pleasure of having Dr. Gustavo join us. Thank you for being here today.
Good to be with you both. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. You know, there's a lot that we have to discuss here in this next 45 minutes or so. I know that you have spoken around the world about culture and have done a lot within this realm. Share with us a little about your background.
Sure. No, I've been very lucky in that I've made several professional transitions. So after graduate school, I typically tell people I spent 4 years in prison working as a psychologist. So my PhD is actually in clinical and school psychology. I went out and did a postdoc in forensic psychology where I worked at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in downtown Manhattan, and then I ran an inpatient drug program for the Federal Bureau of Prisons in Danbury, Connecticut. Then I did 4 years of traditional mental health in a place called Glens Falls, New York, outside of Lake George, New York, upstate New York State. And then I moved in the year 2000, I moved into consulting, and I really never looked back. So I was a consultant for 10 years in the area of organizational culture, creating change for organizations, particularly with around employee engagement, employee relationships. And then 2009, 2010, I started speaking, went on the national speaking circuit, and I kind of stayed there since.
Without getting too political, I am curious, just because you don't come across a lot of people that have spent that amount of time with prisoners and the prison system. What's the personal biggest takeaway?
Wow, great question. I kind of talk about this in my book. The biggest personal takeaway for me is that environment, or what I talk about as culture, but our environment is a much better predictor of our behavior than our personalities or psychologies or even biology. Culture has a strong way of shifting our biology as well. And we know that through science, but we can get into that later. But the biggest takeaway to answer your question is that much of the behavior that we see, whether it's staying apolitical or if you want to think we can go there, but the behavior we see from our neighbors, from our friends, from our colleagues, from people across the street, is much more driven by the environment we create for people than their own personality, what they bring to the table.
And they've found that about, I was watching and reading kind of from the same author, that has a large part to do with addiction as well. People that continue to go back to the same environment have a tendency to stay. And
having worked in that field for several years, they say in addiction, 3 things you change: people, places, and things.
Yeah.
That's the environment.
That's crazy.
It's
amazing.
Those environmental factors create a trigger, which tend to lead people back to addiction.
Oh, great.
So
Awesome.
This is why you say culture is everything. You actually have a TED Talk about this, and people, of course, can go and watch it outside of this, but overall, your concept that culture is everything is dictated by this notion, right?
Right, so culture trumps everything. Culture trumps everything is the name of the TEDx. It's also the name of the book. It's also the name of the presentation that I'm doing. So the concept is that culture is a better predictor of behavior, and it also changes our biology through epigenetics. So part of what I talk about in the presentation in the book is that much of the decisions we make around what we eat, what we drink, if we exercise, and how we manage stress, those are the things that we know change our epigenetics, and those are all very much driven by our culture.
Now, of course, culture is, in this case, very vast. It's in our society, politics, and our life, but you focus within the business realm. As of late, since 2001, you said you've then started speaking, working within the business environment. What have you found that has surprised you uniquely? What stuck out in the business world about culture that most aren't aware of?
Great question. So let's start by giving people a definition, okay? So culture is the context in which we live and work. That's what makes a business, including beliefs, behavioral rules, traditions, and rituals. So those are the components of culture. Beliefs are nothing more than the way we see the world. And I say, when you change the way you see the world changes, which means you change your beliefs, your experience of the world is different. Behavioral rules are the context or the rules that drive our behavior. Traditions and rituals are simply things we do repeatedly. So that's the definition of culture, and it's, if you want to look specifically at organizational, it's the environment or the context in which we live and work. Otherwise, we're talking about culture writ large, culture in our society, which we can also get into. But with regard to one of the biggest, I think, misunderstandings, let's say, that people have about culture. A lot of people think it's, this amorphous thing that you can't control, you can't change it. And I think that's the furthest thing from the truth. I talk about culture starting at the top of an organization, flowing downhill like water with gravity, affecting everyone that it touches. So from my perspective, it is the CEO's role and primary responsibility to create a culture that everyone, that is very clear with regarding to those components, beliefs, behavior, rules, traditions, and rituals, that everyone follows.
Because if they don't create it, the people internally are going to create it. They're going to start
exactly,
shaping it themselves.
I've had a CEO says, well, I don't have a culture. And my response is simply, you have a culture, you just don't know it. Mm-hmm. And if you don't know it, you have no influence over it. Uh-huh. So as CEO, you're primary, that's from my perspective, that's your number one role, your number one responsibility, because everything else follows.
Culture doesn't clock out at 5 o'clock.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Yeah, this is cool. So now when you're going and speaking with organizations, small and large, what is the thing that you see impact them time and time again? Yes, they believe they don't influence it, but what is the thing that they're coming back to you and saying, this has just transformed our organization?
Great question. So I think the biggest challenge for executives, and it depends on the size of the organization, is an awareness that not only do you have an overarching culture, but you can also develop subcultures. So subcultures means that when you get people in groups together, whether it's teams, groups for a project, you put them in different departments, different part of a building, different geographically disparate areas of the country, you're going to get subcultures. So what I talk about in my presentations is, in addition to creating a culture, the CEO, and I would argue that it really moves more to the executive team. We can talk about the members of the culture too. But the issue for executives is you must make sure your subcultures are aligned, which means they're all now behaviors may look differently, let's say in an organization that has an office in San Francisco, Denver, New York City, but they have to be aligned around what are the beliefs, what are the traditions and rituals, and what drives those traditions and rituals. So to answer your question, subcultures is what people I'm often brought into kind of deal with and make sure that they're aligned.
One of the things I've found is as people explore the idea of creating culture, they don't allow for freedom of expression within that culture. It's almost too heavily dictated. What would you say to that? Because there's kind of a balance there, isn't there? There's the idea that these are our belief systems, values, and yet you need diversity of thinking. You need
absolutely
flexibility and freedom to function within those.
Yeah. So people, and I think that's a great point that you bring up, that because people think diversity is ethnic diversity. Mm-hmm. It is in part, but there's also diversity of thought, diversity of habits, diversity of execution. The idea with regard to that type of diversity and that flexibility, let's call it, is to have a culture that sets parameters around what is acceptable behavior, and then allowing people to choose where they fall within those parameters. So, and I'm not saying that you don't have accountability. I'm all about creating a performance-based culture, which is all about accountability. But the issue is, from my perspective, as an example, with regard to flexibility, the 40-hour work week, the 9 to 5, that is a remnant of Henry Ford in 1914. That's it, and we can get into that if you like. But the issue is that if someone can do their job and take 2 hours off in the middle of the day, and they are still part of the team, part of the culture, part of the organization, and meeting their specific goals, then I don't care if they're working from the beach on a lift or wherever they're working. You know, that's the type of flexibility that I talk about in, let's not try and control people's time. Let's agree to what the performance metrics are and make sure everyone's meeting those goals.
I'd love to go down that rabbit hole, because I think so many businesses, including newer businesses that are trying to think outside of the box, are still, because of our education system, because of that Henry Ford model, they're stuck. And they don't really understand the difference between where we should be going and why we're so stagnant in the model. So let's start with why we're stagnant.
Can I give you the history?
Please.
So here's the history. In 1913, Henry Ford in his Hyde Park plant had 14,000 positions he had to keep filled. In 1913, to keep those 14,000 positions filled, he had to hire 52,000 employees. That's a small city. That is a 370% turnover rate. It was eating him alive, and he knew it. By the way, the top 2 reasons businesses fail in this country, number 1 is undercapitalization, which means they run out of money. Number 2 is turnover. Top 2 reasons. So the turnover rate was eating him alive. At the time in 1913, he was paying people $225 a day. They were working 9-hour shifts, 6 days a week. 1914, again, only because of turnover, he flipped his model. He changed his model radically. He said, I'm going to pay people $5 a day, more than doubling their pay. They're going to work 8-hour shifts, 6 days a week. 5 days a week. 8-hour shifts, 5 days a week. Think like Henry Ford a second. When you have 9-hour shifts, how many complete shifts do you get in a 24-hour day?
2.
2, right?
Yeah.
When you go to 8 hours, how many do you get?
3.
He added
That's
1
right.
shift.
Yeah.
In that year alone, with those changes, in that year alone, turnover went from 370 down to 16%.
Wow.
And productivity across all 3 shifts went up by 40%. Between 1914 and 1919, in that 5-year period, productivity across all 3 shifts went up by 70%. And the cost of Model T went from $800 down to $350. So if you wonder why we have a 40-hour work week, you can thank Henry Ford. It's a remnant from that shift. That is, he and everyone else followed.
So that sounds like a win. Why not follow that model now?
Yeah. So it's because it was a manufacturing model.
Yeah.
So we moved from, our economy has moved from manufacturing to service, and I would argue today we're more information technology based society, or certainly economy. So in that model, in a manufacturing model, and we can talk about, I've certainly worked a lot in manufacturing. I lived in North Carolina for 10 years, so I have a great experience with manufacturing environments. But even in a manufacturing environment, to go back to your flexibility, if you build teams around performance of this machine that's got to run at this rate with this level of quality and this level of productivity, you build a team around that and you let them set the schedule. You tie them together with team building. You give them what I call a cause, something larger than themselves, how the product is going to touch people, touch society. Then they don't drop the ball. And they will set the schedule to keep that machine running 24/7, 3-shift operations.
Yeah. That's very interesting. What were you going to ask, Gary?
No, I was going to echo that around performance today. You have an interesting concept that we talk about offline I'd like to reintroduce, and that is this notion around performance and being able to exceed even that 40-hour work week by this buy-in you're talking about. Share, what is the secret sauce today now that companies can implement, or at least be aware of and make progress towards?
Great question, Eric. All right, so in my book I call it quintessence, okay? So quintessence is the effort and desire of the employee, or let's call it just more broadly, members of the culture, to go above and beyond the goal, to contribute in ways that, let's say, hourly employees wouldn't because they check out at 5 o'clock. So, and I talk about quintessence as being an organization's competitive advantage. So I work a lot with CEOs. They're always looking for what's the competitive advantage? What's the competitive advantage in their organization? My response is always the same: it's your culture. And it is specifically, does your culture get the members of your culture to go above and beyond the goal? So quick example here I use is Tesla. So Tesla motor vehicle, as you know, is a purely electric motor vehicle. Elon Musk went to his engineers and said, well, first let's take a step back. So Tesla has a cause. Again, I talk about cause as how your product or service changes the world or changes human experience of the world, which means changes people or touches people individually or touches society. So the cause at Tesla is we want to accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles and electric technology. That's their cause. The whole thinking is if we do that, it'll be better for the environment, better for the planet, et cetera. It's that line of thinking. The challenge to them achieving that cause is what's referred to as range or distance anxiety. People are afraid they're going to run out of juice and end up with a heap of metal on the side of the road. So the first thing Tesla did, they built if you remember, I'm sure you do, they built rapid charging stations up and down the east-west coast, then a line across the center of the country. Not good enough. So Musk went to his engineers with whom he uses what I call social norms, which means he takes money off the table, he pays them fairly and reasonably, then gives them the cause I just shared with you. And he said to them, we need your help to teach our customers that our car batteries are no different than a barbecue propane tank. So I want you, my engineers, to build a system that will allow our customers to drive into a rapid charging station, drop their discharge battery, and pick up a fully charged battery. Mm-hmm. And I want that exchange to happen in 5 minutes, or about the time it takes to fill a fossil fuel gas tank. You have 6 months to do it. They went off to meet that 6-month goal. They have that 5-minute goal in 6 months. They met that 5-minute goal in 4 months. Uh-huh. What did they do with the additional 2 months? They created a system that executes the exchange in 90 seconds. That is culture-driven behavior. That is cause-driven behavior.
Wow.
That's how culture drives behaviors that, let's say, traditional business can't think about it. Mm-hmm. If Elon Musk has said to his engineers, I will pay each one of you $100,000 for hitting that 5-minute goal, what would happen after 4 months? They would have been cashed in checks.
That's right.
They would have stopped at 5 minutes.
Yep.
That's what I'm saying. That culture, that's an example of quintessence. It's going above and beyond the goal. That 5 minutes down to 90 seconds didn't cost them anything. It just gave them a better product.
I love that example. I'm looking at and hearing people's stories about their 40-hour work week. And time again, as we're going in and having interviews with people, there oftentimes is a culture where they're able to achieve their goals within, say, 20 or 25 hours of that 40-hour work week. And then either they're reprimanded or they're not incentivized to be able to maximize the rest of that time. They're asking for other projects. They're trying to balance working between departments. They're trying to exceed their goals because that's their inherent nature, or they do buy into the cause. But then the culture will often reprimand them for that. What is the shift or the gap that management can make so that not just these people, but others in the business community? And that's great for companies like that are so progressive. However, when we're going into a lot of organizations, we're seeing that there are those personalities which will go above and beyond regardless of the cause. They're just, it's in their inherent nature. Yet they're reprimanded when in 25 hours during that work week, they fulfill their roles and responsibilities. So with that remaining 15 to 20 hours, they don't know what to do, or the culture doesn't incentivize or reward them to do that. So how and where within management do you help companies fuel this gap so that not just these individuals, which are overachievers, but the rest of the community, business community, can help with this quintessence idea? Thank you.
Yeah. So great question. So let me, a couple of points I want to respond to. First is when I hear, well, that's their personality, they're just overachievers. While that may be their style and their personality, culture trumps personality means that, and I'm sure you guys have seen this too. If you take an A player and put them in a C culture, they become a C player. If you take a B or C player and you put them in an A culture and they want to be part of that culture, they become an A player. So I always caution about, well, that's their personality, because I've just seen what I'll call potentially high performers put in a very poor culture, and guess what? They're not high performers anymore. Okay, so that's the first piece. But the piece that you're talking about is like, what can leadership, what can management do to kind of create culture? Because I think the example you're using is great for someone who is driven, let's say, by the cause enough to complete what they're, in quotes, supposed to complete in 20 to 25 hours, and they're in essence being punished for finishing too quickly. And I often have walked in kind of, again, manufacturing example, where there's a shift change, and I'm there just watching the shift change, and with the person leaving goes to the person coming in, don't work too hard. It's like, what?
Wow.
Yeah, that is the classic, don't make me look bad, so, drag your feet, whatever. So the first thing I talk about is stop measuring time. Stop measuring time. If you are stuck in the 9 to 5, if you are stuck in the 9 to 5 model, you are stuck in the Henry Ford model. And even in manufacturing today, I think there are many ways you can offer tremendous flexibility around performance. If you're manufacturing, you're manufacturing a product. If you're providing a service, you are providing a service to a person, an organization, or someone. So I try to build teams around the final product or service, and everyone is responsible for the quality of that product going out the door, whether it's a product or service. That's ultimately the key. So if the person who finishes, to answer, going back to your example, if they finish in 25 hours, they are part of a team that has additional capacity, at least from that person, so they can jump in either into, let's say, customer service or product delivery, or maybe be part of another team, or maybe start another project. They can, if they are a tightly knit team and they have a strong performance-based culture, then that person is going to find additional things to support the team without being punished.
But it takes the culture for them to be able to be trained, or at least allow for the flexibility for that crossover.
Yeah,
But again, that's back to culture. You need the operations and systems to be able to support that.
Absolutely agreed. So when you're saying training, I talk about rather than, so historically, for older generations, we all talked about, a corporate ladder. And today I talk about a corporate lattice, like on the side of a house. And the idea of a lattice is we train people by ensuring that every position or organization has a set of skills, core competencies, and those become the nodes in our lattice. And we train people to those core competencies, regardless of where they are today, regardless of what they want to do today. We ask them, what additional skills would you like to learn from this lattice? You got an entire lattice to choose from, and we connect them with people to be coached, to be trained, etc.
So we're talking a lot about the performance side of things and how important it is to create a culture where performance is rewarded, not just the hours you're putting into something. On the flip side, how important, particularly with this next generation coming up, is that lifestyle fit, is the quality of life and the allowing for someone to have a quality of life, and what does that do in regards to performance?
Great. So let's just, since you're talking this next generation, let's just define some generational stuff for us here. So baby boomers, who are typically in the seat of power in most organizations, they are born 46 to 64, which makes them, if I get my math right, this year makes them 54 to 72 years old. Gen Xers, and by the way, there are 84 million of them at their peak. There are 84 million of them in our population. Gen Xers are born between 65 and 81, which makes them 37 to 53 years old. And there are 68 million of them, much smaller generation. Millennials, now these numbers are soft, but let's say the standard with currently being used is 82 to 2000,
right,
which makes them 36 down to 17-ish. And they are 79 million. So demographically, we have 84 million boomers, followed by 68 million Gen Xers, followed by 79 million Gen Ys, which means demographically, 84 million boomers leaving the workforce with only 68 million to backfill. That's a 60 million person gap, which means every organization and every industry is fighting for the same pool of millennials, which in essence, in short, that means they are in the driver's seat. That's the demographic reality. So let's talk about what they want. So boomers were all about time and money. How much time? They created the 70 to 80 hour work week. How much time are you willing to put in at work? And money, how much money can we make? That's what motivated boomers. Gen Xers were much more about productivity and work-life balance. Don't measure my time, measure my productivity, and I'm going to separate work life from my home life and make both are equally important, but they were separated. Millennials, they're motivated by what I refer to as blended life. Blended life means if everything I do has meaning, significance, big picture purpose, and cause, then work doesn't feel like work. It's just a part of my life. So that's why I talk so much in both presentations, both millennial presentation, culture presentations, around cause, because that's the key. And that's, by the way, the key to millennials and older generations too at this point, is that if everything we do has meaning and purpose in our lives, then it doesn't feel like something we have to do. It feels like something we want to do. So it doesn't feel like work. So to go back to your question, it's really, if you're measuring a 9 to 5, in my view for anyone, but particularly a millennial, you'll be lucky to keep them 12 months. They just won't stay because the 9 to 5 is not how they live their lives. And, from my perspective, we all want to be millennials.
And a lot of baby boomers are shifting back to that mindset.
And what the data say is that boomers are leaving the jobs they worked for 20 to 25 years and going to do what they've always wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
So they are now much less motivated by money and much more motivated by relationships and cause, the types of things that motivate.
Which is funny because they seem really confused by the millennial lifestyle, but yet they're jealous of it.
Here's the jealousy, is that boomer, and I can't tell you the number, if I had a nickel for every time I heard this, I paid my dues, I want them to pay their dues. And I just say, look, I'm not suggesting they won't pay their dues, let's allow them to pay their dues differently.
Yeah.
That's it.
That's right. So when it comes to, let's say mission-driven, cause-driven, does it always have to be directly associated to the work that they're doing, or can it be associated to the outcome of the work that they're doing? In other words, does the company need to have a huge mission and some sort of incredible cause attached to it, or can the work that they do have a outcome that points them in the direction towards something that matters to them?
Great question. I want to make sure I understand, but let me for everyone, let's make a clear distinction between mission and cause.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So mission is what you do, cause is why you do it.
Perfect.
So that's the hard line distinction I make.
So it's called cause.
Yeah. So does a company need to have a mission, a cause? I think it's important for an organization to have a cause
Mm-hmm.
that everyone can tie themselves to.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't even have to be, let's say, the majority of the product that the organization does.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll give you an example. Late last year, I was working with a cable manufacturer. 80% of what they make is just traditional copper cable. 20% of what they make is fiber optic cable, which is interesting. And only 10% of their employees work on their fiber optic line. So going through the process that I took them through, their cause became, we help save lives. Now, that seems kind of a stretch, but how did they get there? Well, we went through this process, and again, the concept here is the process doesn't come from the leadership team, doesn't come from me as a consultant, it comes from the floor. So what we found was that of that 20% of their fiber optic cable, a large chunk of it goes into GE heart monitors and MRI machines that go into hospitals all over the country.
Mm-hmm.
It's only 20% of what they make. And only 10% of their employees actually work on that line. But 100% of them think it's cool. So that's why it became their cause.
Mm-hmm.
So again, your question of does it have to be their product? For me, it's where does your product or service touch people or touch society? That's that kind of the fundamentals.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we get to those questions like, if we disappeared, what would our clients miss about us? If we weren't here, where would our clients go to receive the service they get?
Yeah.
How do you talk about what you do to your friends outside of here? How do you talk about what you do to people who don't know you? These are all questions that would inform cause.
How much, so let's say a company is 10 years old, they never really took the time to figure that particular cause-driven message out for the internal motivation. They discover that. How much of the value system should stem from the cause-based campaign?
It's a great question. I think that the cause should fit neatly into the value system. So my guess is that, and sometimes I would say the cause has the capacity, if it's real, to let's say, I wouldn't say do a 180, but to redirect the value system. And I would suggest in a positive way. If it's something that, again, they can all rally around. Because the biggest mistake that I experience with cause is, I'll get a phone call, and in the consulting side of my world, I'll get a phone call. It'll be some executive saying, yeah, we read your book, we hear you do this cause thing. Yeah. Well, we came up with a cause a couple of years ago, and it never stuck. Well, my response, well, really? Why don't you tell me how you went about doing this? And they will say something like, well, we took our executive team, we went on a 1 week offsite, we created a cause, we brought it back, and it never stuck. Gee, that's a total mystery to me. I can't imagine how that happened. They never involve their employees.
Right.
That's the key. So if your, let's say, mission statement has something to do with profitability first, A strong cause is going to shift that. Because a strong culture with a strong cause is going to understand that profit follows culture. That's what I refer to as the profit paradox. When you build a strong culture, and we don't have the slides here, but I have a slide that documents companies that focus on culture first make more profit. Companies that focus on profit first make less profit. And profit is just a lot easier to measure, so that's what people want to focus on. But it ends up costing you more.
It's powerful. So you mentioned Tesla earlier regarding the ability to create an environment for performance. When it comes to cause, what's a good example where a company has nailed that?
Well, I think Tesla has one. Who else can we talk? I mean, do you want public or ones that I've worked with? Because
your favorite.
Yeah. So I think the electrical cable manufacturer is one that I really like because that's most recent. One that I'll give you several. So I worked with a rebar manufacturer in a rural part of North Carolina, and their rebar goes into all sorts of schools and bridges and things like that. And their cause became, we build the things that bring people together. Now, how do we get there? So again, we were going through this process, and we found out that a bunch of their rebar had gone to build a new Yankee Stadium in New York. Yankee Stadium is a place where people come together to celebrate their sports teams and to celebrate each other's company. Large part of the rebar goes to build architectural bridges. Architectural bridges are beautiful to look at, and they span distant places to bring people together. So their cause became, we build the things that bring people together for a rebar manufacturer. So I work with a pool cover manufacturer whose cause became, we bring families together and keep them safe. A paving company, we pave the way for today and the future. And each one has a story, its own story, but a tire changing company whose cause became, we get people back to work. It's where does your product or service touch people or touch society?
Overall, whether it be business or otherwise, all of this isn't anything new. I mean, this goes back to people's fundamentals nature of wanting to be able to be a part of something bigger than themselves and to have purpose. And so we're seeing now in commercialism this be adopted because people's priorities are now shifting to more culture-centric businesses and dynamics, supporting and buying products and services that support causes, equally working for those, for companies that are not prone to adapt, for the ones that want to stay stagnant and not look at culture or address these issues within their company. How fast do you see them going to the wayside? Because there will be competitors which are going to implement these principles. How quickly do you see that, shifting even the Fortune 500 companies?
It's great, again, Eric, great question. Let me just say, I think you absolutely nailed it. Because again, this is what you nailed. People's primary human drives are to connect and belong. Connect means build relationships with. Belong, as you said, means to belong to something larger than ourselves. That's I refer to that as having a cause. So this transition, in my view, is accelerating. Why? Because of the generational shift we were talking about. I think regardless of your generation, boomers have made the money they want to make, are going to make, etc. So they're following along in the shift. Gen Xers, and look, I'm a Gen Xer, and I'll say, we're simply demographically, we are too small a generation to be influential in the workforce. And I'll say, as there were things that Gen Xers wanted to have in their work week, let's say flexible job schedule, 4-day work week, that we tried to implement and got kind of overwhelmed by boomers. Boomers didn't allow us that. That's exactly it. Yep. Millennials are making it stick. So some of the things that Gen X kind of tried to work, we weren't big enough a generation. Millennials are making it stick. So because, look, unemployment, I think last numbers I looked at, unemployment nationally are 3.9%. Here in Colorado, they're 2.6%. In a state like Maine, it's 2.1%. And the very conservative governor of Maine, Paul Page, has started to commute inmate sentences to try and get them out back into the workforce. Every company, every industry is fighting the same pool of employees. So my point is, it's an accelerating factor. is that companies that can't adapt or won't adapt going to go the way of the dinosaurs.
Because they won't have a workforce.
They won't have people. That's exactly right.
Or quality people. They'll have people, but they'll be those ones that aren't buying into quintessence.
Right. Or they don't know how to build a culture to get the in quotes, the right people, or the people who are willing to adapt to the culture that they create.
We've joked about this recently, but I feel like these people things are getting in the way of business.
Yeah. Business would be easy if not for the people, right?
One of these days, we'll crack that code.
Yeah, those AI robots, they're going to be buying a lot of things.
Autonomy is coming. And, we can talk about automatic vehicles and autonomous vehicles. That's another kind of big challenge for us as a society.
What's in your view? How is that going to change society? Because there will be a lot of manufacturing jobs which support America that will be replaced by automation. How is that going to affect the workforce? How are people and companies going to adapt, or is it going to create new jobs? What do you see is happening in that regard?
Yeah, such a good question. All right, so a quick example here. Okay, today there are about 8 million people that work in the transportation industry, from taxis to trucking, what have you. When you put together the technology of Uber, which obviously is well established, and the automated vehicle, which is less than 5 years away, those people are out of a job due to no fault of their own.
That's right.
What do you do with 8 million people in our society who are out of a job due to no fault of their own? That's what I call a culture writ large or societal question. And if you look in the literature, the answers are everything from you're on your own to something in the neighborhood of universal basic income, or UBI. So the answer is we don't have an answer as a society. But if you consider, let's think about, again, the transitions we talked about. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, we were a manufacturing society, manufacturing economy. In order to make that transition, people basically went from the farm to the factory. Both manual labor, they were transitions of skills, but all manual labor. Most people made that transition. Then we went from manufacturing to service. Well, there's another transition of skills, but it goes from manual to more people-oriented. Many people made that transition, but many did not. Now we're going from service to information technology. And that transition is another huge transition, but more importantly, technology has accelerated the skills required, required to acquire the skills required technology. So the point is, if you don't know where the on button is on a computer, it's very unlikely you're going to be able to program, code, or run any type of computer or machine that works using a touchscreen as its interface. So my point simply is, if people say, well, you're on your own, that may have worked 100 years ago because the skill set transition was much smaller in distance. Today, it is huge. So we don't have an answer to answer your question, but what I'm saying is this is something that we need to be thinking about as a society, because just in the driving example, in the transportation example, 8 million people out of work.
That will shape our community's culture. And while it might be great for some businesses, it could severely impact society at large.
I believe it's going to. And to your point, our community culture, we have subculture in the United States. You think about differences in the East Coast and West Coast, Northeast, Southeast, Denver and other cities, Denver, Midwest, there are different, we have subcultures. Our communities do indeed have subcultures. And I absolutely believe that different communities, different societies, different parts of our country are going to deal with this problem very differently.
How important is that? So as an example, at SoCap, we've gotten heavily involved in the community, particularly the community that's right around us. And we were talking about those circles, right? Richard Branson was talking about sub-circles that are impacting your environment, both in business and in personal, and then you expand out to the community right around you, your neighborhood, and then you expand out to the state, then you expand out to the U.S., and then you look at global, right? And they're all circles. And what's your influence within that? So for us, we've chose to really own and love this lower downtown area, Lodo.
Yeah.
Within it, we see a lot of these same issues that we're talking about within the business community, internally inside business, happening within the district here. How important is it for not just businesses to be listening to this, but those neighborhoods and those communities, and figuring out game plans to have strategy and implement ways to educate that would support these 8 million people and beyond.
Yeah, first let me say, I think the fact that you guys are so community focused is going to be clearly your competitive advantage. Because it's how people will know you. They will know you for not only your service, but how you're affecting Lodo. So hands down, I think that is going to be your competitive advantage. I think it probably is already. If it's not, and that again is going to accelerate. I think that when you have businesses teaming together to shift the community, then again you're creating a subculture in that community, and whether people work here, live here, it's like the air that we breathe. It's like the water that fish swim in. You know, everyone's affected by it. You know, you can have, let's say, go back to our example of, you know, you can have a genetically perfect fish. You put it in toxic water, it's not going to live very long.
Right.
You know, you put it in the type of water, whether it's fresh water, salt water, the type of water it needs at the right temperature, it will have a very fulfilling life. What you are doing is you're creating that environment. You're creating the water for the fish, the air that we breathe. It's part of what we all live off of, what we all share. So kudos to you. I applaud you for it.
So culture trumps everything. You guys can be able to watch his TED Talk, buy his book, visit Dr. Gustavo on drgustavo.com. One final takeaway, if there are business owners or just community members at large listening to this, whether we've addressed it or not, what's something that they just need to recall, to be able to share, to implement? What's the biggest takeaway that you'd invite people to really take home?
Yeah, the biggest takeaway for me, the title "Culture Trumps Everything" really means whether you're a CEO, whether you are a leadership team member, or whether you are a member of a culture. I think the biggest misunderstanding is, or let's say the undervaluing is, the power of culture. Culture is a lot more powerful than people give it credit for. And if you are executive or leadership, part of a leadership team, from my view, yes, we talked about performance is key, and I'm not suggesting culture allows you to drop performance. I've never lowered performance in an organization. So the issue is, culture is the primary driver of performance. I've gone into organizations and said you need to clarify your culture, you need to clarify your standards of performance, you need to get some standards of performance, but I've never said lower. The issue is you build a culture first, profit, performance follow.
Beautiful. Really? Well, thank you so much for joining us on SoCap Talks. It has been an absolute pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you so much to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.